So hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, the first of 3 in November, as we demystify even the metaverse with our friends and industry partners from Make Real. I'm going to hand over as quickly as possible because you're not here to listen to me. But first things first, just a reminder that live captions are available for this session and for the recording. Just go to the controls at the bottom of the screen. And of course, a full recording of this session will be available in the members area of the Learning Network website. Finally, one final thing from me. Nominations yesterday did open to join the board here at the Learning Network. So if it's something you're interested in or you know someone who'd be interested, now's the time to get in touch with any of the directors to discuss what's involved, what kind of commitment it takes, and of course, to start looking for someone to second your nomination. With all of that out of the way, let me hand over straight away to our guest speakers today. If I hand over to yourselves, and then you can wow us with the future.
I'm going to start sharing a PowerPoint presentation, which I don't really know is the future, but it's where we're starting. So excuse me, 1 second. I rehearsed this and everything. There we go. Is that sharing all right? Can everyone see that?
It is. Yeah.
Lovely. So we should probably start by telling people who we are. Robin, would you like to go first?
Robin Scott, I'm Managing Director. That's me pre my midlife crisis hair in that photo. But I'm the Managing Director and one of the founders of Make Real.
I'm Sophie Costin, Director of Learning, pictured there with my midlife crisis hair. Yeah, I'm going to be one of the speakers today.
And I'm Tim Powell-Jones, Principal Immersive Learning Designer with my midlife crisis beard, which has since shrunk slightly.
Nice. So I just wanted to do a quick bit of positioning before we get started today. So this session isn't going to be us telling you exactly what the metaverse is going to be and how it's going to revolutionize learning and what you guys all need to do to keep up. It's very much going to be a conversation. So this conversation started because we realized that the word metaverse was cropping up a lot, as someone mentioned in the comments, and we were being asked increasingly, what is the metaverse? You know, how can we be bringing learning into it? And can we have a metaverse demo? And we kind of identified that depending on which day of the week and who was being asked, we were all probably giving slightly different answers. So we started a little period of research here at Make Real Towers, looking at different viewpoints, looking at how people are starting to use it in the here and now, so that we could build a shared understanding from a Make Real perspective as to what the metaverse is and how clients could get started with it. So we really encourage you to join in today, add comments in the chat, ask questions as we go, and we'll leave a good amount of time for questions at the end too, because this is an evolving landscape, so it's all very much open for discussion. And sort of a side note of caution if you hear anyone telling you otherwise, because ultimately the metaverse, you couldn't even look it up in the dictionary until recently. And with that in mind, I'm going to hand over to Robin to kick us off with a definition of what the metaverse even is.
Indeed, an unenviable task, defining something that is many things and nothing all at once. But so as Sophie said, I'm going to open up by trying to look at the various definitions of what's being referred to currently, and that's quite a key point, as the metaverse with a sort of capital M. I just want to be clear as well that we're not here to promote it as a concept or to detract from it, but really to sort of try and cut through some of the hype and some of the buzzwords and really talk about what it is today, and you know how it can be used, where we think it's actually at, and where we think it's actually heading. And I'm going to start off by showing just how disparate some of those definitions can be. And I just want to also make it clear that whatever definition, I mean, I had in researching this webinar, I waded through hundreds of definitions, and these aren't necessarily even my favorite, but what they're here to illustrate is just how disparate some of the definitions are. And that's one of the challenges in and of itself. So I'm going to start off with 2 or 3 here that just show some of the different ways of looking at it. So the first one here is from The Economist, that defines the metaverse as the limitless successor to the internet, first imagined by Neil Stephenson in his book Snow Crash 30 years ago. Now that really is a bit of an origin story around some of the current hype and buzzwords that are in play. Certainly the metaverse, sort of capital T, capital M, really came into the consciousness when Mark Zuckerberg made a big play for it in the not too distant past. And certainly a lot of the language used there certainly was in that Neil Stephenson book. Although the concepts and some of what he describes are familiar with what's occurring today, other parts of it aren't as well. But that's one take on it from The Economist. From Ed Grieg, someone we know well, who's Chief Disruption Officer at Deloitte, he put it. He opened up a much longer definition with this statement, which is, in the simplest terms, the metaverse is the internet, but in 3D, which isn't necessarily inaccurate, but it probably doesn't tell the whole story either. And Sophie, if you can flick on to the next slide, here's a much more technical one from William Burns III, who's another sort of chap who's been very vocal around the metaverse and virtual worlds concept for a number of years in the US. And he put it much more technically and wordly as a collective virtual shared space created by the convergence of virtual enhanced physical reality and physically persistent virtual space, including the sum of all virtual worlds, augmented reality, and the internet. So kind of everything in the whole world and the internet and everything. And as you can see, that's difficult to even read, let alone sort of wrap your head around all the different parts of it. And the point I'm making there, as I said, is that we have these very, very disparate definitions of what it is, all sort of hung off of this current use of the metaverse as a buzzword. If you go back pre-metaverse, a lot of people would have thought of them as virtual worlds as opposed to the metaverse. And you might hear me use that terminology or slip into that terminology as we move through, because that's something I'm more familiar with using. And the truth is that all of these definitions can be useful, but they're all a bit flawed as well. So rather than worrying about trying to define it, one of the things to look at is, what commonalities are there? And understanding different people's definition of it based on their viewpoint can be quite interesting. So Sophie, if you can flick onto the next slide. What I'm going to do for over the next couple of slides is take you through these definitions, but apply to what are some of the common platforms that you could describe today as metaverses, rather than the metaverse, capital T, capital M, because in reality, it's hard to make a case that the metaverse exists as of today. But these are all different platforms that could be said to be metaverses in and of their own right. So, as the title says, it depends who you ask. So let's start on the left there. We've got the sort of Web 3.0 view of the world. Now, this is all sort of cryptocurrency and crypto token driven. And the argument there would be it's all about decentralization and creator ownership, etc. And there's a couple of platforms that I've listed out below the Web 3.0 view of the world, or view of the metaverse world, in Decentraland and the Sandbox. Now, the promise of Web 3.0 is that rather than Web 2.0, which is your YouTubes, your social media channels, your Amazons, where big tech owns the internet and you are a user that that uses those big tech platforms, the sort of dream of Web 3.0 is that all of that goes out of the window and everything is owned by the user. And these platforms have emerged as a result. Now they're new and there's a lot of overhyping around them, certainly in my opinion. So Decentraland and Sandbox, they're both built off cryptocurrencies. You buy real estate by buying or exchanging those tokens, and then that leads to voting systems that lead to functionality decisions and all kinds of stuff. They've been very, very hyped, and you've probably seen stories of brands like Nike and Adidas and lots of consumer brands spending lots of money on space in those platforms. A lot of hype over the last year, but actually, if you look at the user numbers, they are tiny. They are absolutely tiny, and there's quite a lot of discussion right now about exactly how many daily users Decentraland has. And depending on which article you believe, it's anything from 62 up to about 650, which I think we can all agree is not very many. So the hype that's being touted around about the massive commercialization of those spaces and people earning billions from digital asset sales within the next year or two is probably a little bit overstretched. Then let's move on to the big tech view of the world. So there we've got alt space, which I saw someone mentioned in chat, and someone mentioned we could have met in alt space, which we certainly could. The reason we didn't is because like all of these platforms, there is some overhead to being set up. And for those users that are coming in that don't necessarily want to, or haven't had the time to go through and set up accounts in these different spaces, we wanted to make sure this talk was accessible as possible. But that is also indicative of where we're at, right? The fact that there is a bit of overhead to getting set up and so on. And I'll come on to that a little bit more when we talk about metaverse literacy. But for big tech, it's all about platforms, tools, and infrastructure. So what we've got here is AltSpace, which is owned by Microsoft. For anyone who's not aware, it started off as a startup and Microsoft then purchased it. And then you've also got your Horizon Worlds or Horizon Workspaces, which is Meta, Facebook, and their equivalency. And they're really invested in their sort of walled gardens, no matter what Mark Zuckerberg might say. There's no evidence to say that he's going to give all of this infrastructure and everything away for free, certainly not without the usual concerns around data harvesting and so on. But to give you a sense about the infrastructure requirements for the sort of big picture metaverse, the common consensus is that we need something like 1,000 times the server capacity, computing power that we have for Web 2.0 in order to make a future metaverse that's all encompassing a reality. And so we're just really in the early stages of that. And then finally, we've got this third group, gamers and consumers. And I tag that line with, haven't we been doing this for ages? Because in truth, they have. And you could argue, and many do, that platforms like Second Life, which I'm sure many of you will have heard of, and Roblox, which you've probably certainly heard of if you're a young, if you've got kids or certainly a younger demographic. These are virtual, online, perpetual worlds, often with their own currencies and so on and so forth. And Second Life's been around since 2003. And, compared to something like Decentraland, Second Life has about somewhere between 64 and 70 million active accounts. That's accounts that have logged in within a meaningful time frame of the last 2-3 months, and its average concurrent users at any one given time is in the hundreds of thousands. So as you can see, the difference between Second Life and Decentraland is quite marked. But the other point here is that if you went into any of these platforms, you would see a lot of commonality: the ability to go in and create an avatar, the ability to build your own personal or corporate space within those environments, which is absolutely fundamental to them. So again, all of these look and feel similar if you were to log into them, but if you were to look at who's creating them, they would have a very different viewpoint on what they are. You can flick onto the next slide, please, Sophie. And here's just a little comparison chart to bring that to life a little bit. And again, a lot of these are grey areas. I've sort of boiled these down to a few key things that I think are important, certainly in the learning sphere. But that doesn't mean this is 100% right, because obviously we've had to boil it down to a few categories and there are some grey areas which I'll touch on. But the ability to build your own world, so you can build your own corporate environment or build your own personal environment. The ability to customize the functionality, so you can have designed learning experiences within those worlds. Multi-device access, which is really important. One of the common misconceptions is that the metaverse is a VR thing or an AR thing. Actually, it can be accessed from any device. And I've got a nice quote here, actually. This is from Danny Unger, who is the CEO of Cloudhead Games, which have made some of the most successful early VR applications and experiences and games. And he said that VR is a medium and the metaverse is a tool that one day might use the medium in a compelling way. And I really agree with that, as to a lot of sort of industry, veterans, for want of a better description, if you can be a veteran after sort of 8-10 years. But the point there is that often it's sort of interlinked inherently with virtual reality. And whilst virtual reality is definitely one of the core technologies or core access technologies to it, it's not fundamental to it in and of itself. The ability, the cost involved. Is it free to use and build? And I've kind of grouped those together. And again, that's a little bit of a grey area. But Altspace, for example, is completely free to set up an account to start building your own worlds, which we've done for several clients and ourselves. Horizon Meta Horizons is the same. Decentraland, if you really want to start building, you have to buy real estate, and therefore, again, there's a cost associated with that. And then Second Life, again, you can start building for free. Risk factor, this is, you know, somewhat of a subjective measure. And the reason I put this in is looking at sort of stability, longevity, the likelihood that it's still going to be there, the hype factor around it. And again, looking at something like Altspace, it's backed by Microsoft in a corporate, certainly a corporate learning environment. You'd have to say the risk there is fairly low. It's backed by major tech. Most corporates are already using Microsoft, so they're comfortable with them as a tech provider. It's free, and so on and so forth. Something like Decentraland at the other end of the spectrum, it costs quite a lot to get involved. It's a brand new platform. It's being quite overhyped, and I'm not criticizing it as a platform. I'm just trying to talk, you know, honestly, is the way as I see it about where we're at with that. And then finally, you've got complexity. Again, this is more about how difficult is it to start experimenting in these spaces. And again, Altspace is quite low complexity. We've built many environments for our clients to have meetings in and all kinds of demos and things like that. We've not had to use a developer. One of our 3D artists has created all of these environments using some free to download tools. So the complexity of getting started is really rather low. And again, you can see across the rest of the chart there. But another thing that's noticeable about this chart is that the longer the platforms have been around, the more of what we need today they actually have. Second Life over on the right there has been around the longest by far, since 2003. And as you can see, apart from the multi-device access, because it's always been desktop, and again, that's a bit grey because you can hack it and get in there in VR, but it's certainly not an off-the-shelf sort of offering there. But that has, you know, one of the best sets of stats there in terms of its risk, its complexity, and the functionality. And then Altspace has been around the next longest amount of time. And again, you can see it's got sort of more of what I feel we need today. So just moving forward, Sophie, conscious of time, sorry. This, in terms of where are we at today, this is my personal viewpoint on where we're at today. Today, I think that several different flavors of the metaverse coexist, but they exist in a siloed and non-interoperable way. None has the full range of features needed to support experiences, commerce, and learning, but they're improving all the time. So it's my view that now is a good time to experiment in a low-cost, low-risk way. And that's why I included some of those categories on the previous comparison chart. And I think that brings me to the end of my sort of opening bit about you know, the definitions of the metaverse, the viewpoints of it. But as I say, if you cut through all of that, hopefully what you saw in those platforms that a lot of you will recognize is the commonality is there in terms of having virtual worlds that persist, whether you're in there or not, that are social. And one of the big things that's missing right now is interoperability, which is another one of the sort of core pillars of the metaverse as it's been conceived. And I think now we're going to open this up. So I'm going to push back to Tim and Sophie, really, and get their views on this. And if you guys would mind, perhaps Sophie, if you want to go first, just sort of sharing your thoughts on that. We were originally going to pick out our favorite definition, but actually, I don't think it's quite worked out that way the more we've looked at it. So Sophie, over to you.
Yeah, I don't really, and I'd be really interested to know what everyone else thinks as well, if you want to enter into the chat as well and enter into the conversation. But for me, it's not a thing yet, so you can't really define it. But my metaverse kind of aha moment, because we genuinely have been doing our own little bits of research back at Make Real Towers. So each week we've been sitting down and looking at various bits. And I think my metaverse aha moment came in a Kathy Hackle talk. She's a great one to follow, futurist, and I think her job title is like Metaverse Chief Officer or something. This is now coming into the world of work. And she was talking about the convergence of our digital selves and our physical selves. And so it's not this kind of, I was always sort of uncomfortable or like not sold on this Ready Player One idea where the physical world all becomes a bit bleak and we just try and leave it behind for this kind of digital utopia that we're all just trying to escape into. Like, it just didn't feel right. It didn't feel very human. But she talks about this convergence of your digital and your physical self. So maybe, your physical world becomes a bit more digital. Maybe we do start all wearing AR headsets. And so there's that kind of bleed of the digital into the physical. And then conversely, our digital worlds, maybe we are working more in a sort of 3D space, and that all becomes a bit more physical. So it's not really about moving towards this new virtual utopia. It's this kind of breaking down of the walls and the two things mixing together. Someone's come up with the VHS versus Betamax analogy. I think, Tim, that was something that you were saying, which, it is that kind of moment. Which do you choose? And it's sort of there at the moment.
We could talk a lot about that as well, because the evolution of hardware and software is another topic that we could easily do an hour on, but we won't go there just yet on the interest of time. So Tim, do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm also going to dodge giving a definition. But, apart from VHS and Betamax, we've already talked about loads of really interesting bits of tech, right? 3D, VR, augmented reality. We've touched on stuff like blockchain and NFTs and all these like interesting bits of web technology. And I think the thing is, where we are at the moment is there's nothing that links them together in a way that makes sense to people, that makes sense to us as humans. So if you think about most 2D content, you've got Google, you've got search engines that are helping you navigate through that. You've got walled gardens like Facebook and other bits of social media that help you navigate through that and understand how all these things link. But that's what we don't have for some of the newer emerging technologies. And I think if we're getting towards something that's a metaverse, that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to make it understandable to people, to humans. But then, you mustn't forget a lot of the kind of actors behind this. Companies like Meta are also trying to create an awful amount of economic value while they do that, or potential economic value.
I think that linked thing is really important. That's something someone in the chat, Richard Price here, is saying, it almost advocates that it should have some international governance, because if it's not linked, if it is owned by one company, well, it's not the metaverse. I think that's kind of fundamentally it.
Well, I think governance and law are lagging behind the technology, as is often the case on that one. Just to summarize that before we move on as well, there are some really interesting points, and you just mentioned Richard Price is there. Yeah, I think we all hate the idea of it being owned by one company, and that's absolutely against the principles of it. And it was very weird hearing Mark Zuckerberg get up and sort of talk about it as his own personal crusade, given what we all how we all perceive Meta and Facebook and their desire to own things. But a couple of things I would just say. Firstly, to allude to Tim's point about things being linked. There's been a lot in the press in the last few weeks about the negative side of the metaverse, with Meta laying off staff and so on and so forth. And one quote I liked from Larry Rosenthal, who runs a blog called Cubic Space, and he mentioned that with that interlinked nature, the reason that the metaverse is currently becoming a bit of a whipping boy for mainstream media is that there is no free web of content, which there was at the dawn of the internet. So, there's this perception, at least, that you need to buy some sort of a device like a VR headset, and then you're going to have a load of paid content that you have to pay for. Whereas at the dawn of the internet, what you had was a web of academic content and other free content that was then slowly monetized over time, whereas we're sort of starting at or people are trying to start at the monetized level with the metaverse. And I will actually jump off the fence. I wasn't going to, but I'm going to jump off the fence and give a definition which is probably my favorite, because I think it encapsulates everything we've talked about and cuts through some of it. This is from Scott Hayden, who's the editor of Road to VR, and after several other definitions, he said the metaverse, and he purposely left out the part of metaverse. He's just put metaverse, a summation of all digital spaces accessible by AR, VR, or traditional platforms. It was here, it is here, and it will be here regardless of how platform holder competition, i.e. one person owning it, shakes out. It's basically just another word for the internet and everything. And he put a little TM at the end of that as well. But I think that kind of, as close as any other definition, cuts through everything we've just discussed to give a sense of it, really. So yeah, it's become a bit of a catch-all phrase. Anyway, but time's moving on.
Shall we?
Yeah. Let's move on.
With that, I think we're going to hand over to Tim to look at some examples of how it's going to be used today.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to take you through, well, having established the metaverse doesn't really exist in any way that we can define it, I'm going to give you some great examples of how it's used. And primarily, I'm going to talk really about how it's used for learning, because that's kind of, that's my bag, really. So if we go on to the next slide, I know we've already had a little bit of a go at Meta, but I'm going to continue. So this is how learning in the metaverse is being advertised on the tube at the moment, which is very much this idea of, go back in time, go anywhere, learn about things in the metaverse, which is, kind of interesting. It's an interesting idea, but actually the reality of that, I don't think is quite there. We've seen Meta investing 150 million on metaversities, which again seems like an awful lot of money, but that's for 10 institutions across the United States. And the idea of all these people, of all these universities being able to create amazing content that takes you back in time it's kind of not there, right? There are experiences that will do that. Assassin's Creed will do that. You can go back in time to ancient Greece and you can actually learn about stuff. That's 500 million pounds, $500 million worth of game development. So actually how things are looking in terms of metaversities is looking more like digital twins of university spaces, albeit sometimes with dinosaurs. And if that is reminding you of something, then that is reminding you of Second Life, because a lot of it is looking really quite similar. And, as much as Second Life is a genuinely fascinating space, I don't think that's the sort of thing that's going to get people really interested in learning in the metaverse. So what I'll do is look at some other stuff, which is beyond that kind of official definition, and we can really see some of the interesting stuff that's happening, because it is interesting, right? So as Robin touched on, the people who are already doing this, 100% definitely doing this, big games for kids, multi-user persistent worlds where people really do want to go and hang out. You've got millions and millions of people going into these places and spending loads of time. And I think it's really interesting to look at them, not necessarily because they are spaces we want to be in now, but they're spaces where you're going to see innovation coming out of. And, one of the interesting things in this is the way that they handle in-game economies, and certainly this idea of blurring the lines between the real and the digital. A nice example is thinking about a block in Minecraft that is on your screen that you can interact with and do lots of stuff with. And then the plushy soft toy Minecraft block that you have on your desk. And you look at them, you think, which of these is actually real? And if you have an answer to that, then you're doing pretty well. So, they create a lot of value. They're really interesting. And they've also got this thing of, sorry about this, but the metaverse. So this is, there might be one person in Minecraft telling a story or building a world, but you might have 1 million people watching him on YouTube, or watching her on YouTube. There's Twitch streams, there's YouTube, there's Discord, there's TikTok, there's a huge amount of physical merchandise all being generated by just set amounts of activity that's happening in there. So I think what's interesting about that in terms of thinking about what is the metaverse is it's not just what's happening in the 3D world, but it's how that is then being talked about in the wider cultural conversation. How useful is this for learning? You skipped ahead too quick.
Oh, I'm sorry. I spoiled your best lines.
You did. It's kind of useful for learning. If you're the cool teacher and you want to be delivering a lesson in Roblox, then brilliant. But for us at the moment, so. So if we now do skip ahead slightly.
I had one job. I just had one job.
Yeah, man. But why is it good for learning? How can it be good for learning? I've talked about two things which maybe aren't, but I genuinely believe it is going to be amazing. So this is this is a nice framework from Diana Laurillard at London Knowledge Lab. And we all know that 3D worlds are pretty great for learning. We do a lot of VR, we do a lot of kind of 3D development and learning, and like creating an environment where people can learn, allowing them to practice. It's great, works incredibly, incredibly well. But there are certain things that I find are often missing, which are this kind of stuff. So as well as just your environment and your practice, what's all the stuff that's happening around that? Because it is always happening around it, right? It's your concepts, your peers' concepts, your teacher concepts. I know the word teacher is here, but that could be facilitator, could be instructor, it could be boss, whoever it is who's sort of managing this space. Now, what's been happening for a long time is that in the 3D, you've got the practice and you've got the learning environment, but all the stuff that happens around it probably happens, I don't know, maybe in a classroom, maybe informally, face to face, but where it's not happening is within the learning context itself. And where we really, really see the value of Metaverse for learning is being able to do all of this in context, allowing all this kind of learning to be happening and sort of like then feed back into the environment that you're in. So when I'm going to speak about three or four examples now, and I think these three examples all to some extent manage to get this kind of cycle going on. If you want to print screen this framework, you can do that now. I always find it incredibly useful, but do it quickly because I think we're going to go on to the next.
3, 2, 1, gone.
So I'm going to talk about three examples here. Now, this is not capital M metaverse stuff. We've been doing a lot of research for this presentation, and it is challenging to find examples of things which sort of really feel like, yes, that is metaverse and that's being used for learning really well. But I think what we have seen is lots and lots of elements of what you see in the metaverse being used in designed learning experiences that are being used all across the sector. They might not be persistent, they might not be interoperable, they might not have crypto, but to be honest, some of it's still pretty radical and really, really interesting to see. And the example on the left is, well, actually, this was something that was my aha moment with 3D multi-user learning, because this was being developed by my friend Mark for Kilo Solutions. And he gave me an alpha sort of test of it right at the very start of lockdown when I'd not spoken to anybody for ages. And just being able to go into the bridge of a ship and be told exactly how to do things, how the instruments work together. I was being told by Mark, who's a very experienced sailor. It made it make sense to me in a way that it really hadn't before. And, I've done a fair amount of design of like nautical and maritime training. But actually being in the place with an expert teacher, being incredibly sarcastic about my efforts to crash the ship, it's something that really, really stuck with me. So I think from that and in other things I've seen as well, it really feels like it's something that's great for learners, but it's also something that's really great for teachers and for people. And I think that's why I put the Network Rail example in there, which is something we're working on. Network Rail have some amazing, amazing instructors, people with like decades of knowledge of working on the railway. And what I've always found is this doesn't always translate brilliantly into just a classroom where you're far away from the things that you should be talking about. And this is the kind of thing that we're looking at doing with them, is actually being able to put them back in the space that they know, so they can take people along and they can point out everything that needs to be seen. And I think that is something that's working really nicely, not just good for learners, good for teachers as well. And I think the last one in there that I'm just going to skip over kind of briefly is just to say that it's not just VR, it's not just on your desktop. You can do this kind of stuff in augmented reality and mixed reality as well, giving people this shared conception of an idea that you're then able to change, modulate, and discuss. And I think it's the discussion really for me that is making this really, really good. So you might have noticed that those three jumped the gun again, Sophie. It's because I'm taking too long. You might have noticed that those three all feel quite industrial, right? They're all quite sort of big industry, rail, maritime construction. You know, where we also want to look at is on the next slide, which is really being able to use some of the platforms that we've talked about earlier to deliver learning. And I think, again, difficult to find amazing examples, but these are places where there's a lot more flexibility in terms of the space. You may not be able to design your experience quite so well. The practice may not be quite as tailored as it would be otherwise. But something like AltSpace in particular gives loads and loads of affordances that allow you to go and speak to people, to interact with people in interesting ways.
I was just going to say, Tim, I mean, I think just this week, we've actually taken one of our clients, Lloyds Bank, and ran a full AltSpace session for some of their senior stakeholders on this topic as well, but we did it within AltSpace, and it was a very different experience as well. Again, that could be a webinar in and of itself. The differences in doing a sort of chalk and talk presentation with a learning aspect within one of these worlds as well is just fascinating. The behaviors that people exhibit are very different to what they would exhibit in the real world. And it's been very interesting in the future to see how you can harness those kind of things. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think there's just one more slide that I wanted to talk about really quickly. Just bringing back to that, you know, Accenture, one of the people that we've seen investing most heavily in this, in the headsets, in the metaverse, in sort of developing a really nice AltSpace environment used for lots of different things like new hires, socializing, meetings, all the kind of things that you might do in a meeting room, right? But I don't want to try and guess Accenture's strategy here, but I'm going to, and I think it really is that this idea of having your workforce fluent in metaverse, you know, in much the same way we can just log on to Teams, right? We can send emails. It's fine. It's second nature. You're not going to get there unless you're in there and you're doing it. And this really feels kind of like what they're doing. It's like, yes, you may be learning about something in there, but you're also learning about the space and you're learning about how to sort of coexist in that space and do different and interesting things. So that is a whistle-stop tour of some stuff that hopefully you will agree is quite interesting as examples. Really, really nice opportunity now as we take a breather, just to put any examples that you've seen. You know, you've seen a few of the things we talked about. It's like multi-user, 3D, these kind of flexible spaces. Have you seen it being done well? I'm genuinely interested.
Whilst we're waiting for some people to type in there as well, I just sort of say as well, whilst that Accenture case study is probably the biggest investment we've seen, you know, it's not just unrealistic, but it's also not necessary for the vast majority of organizations. Buying 60,000 headsets isn't the right thing to do. Accenture, obviously a technology consultancy, so there is a very good reason for them to do so. But that sort of metaverse literacy that you mentioned, Tim, I think is a really good first step. And certainly we have clients with far fewer headsets, but by running good targeted sessions in hubs where there's good footfall and so on and so forth, and then remotely as well, is a great first step. Yeah, so just waiting. Sorry, sorry, Richard's got to drop out. Is there anybody in the chat who has seen any other good examples that they'd like to raise or they'd like to bring up?
Well, while we're waiting for anyone to contribute who wants to contribute, I really like your point, Tim, about potentially what Accenture's strategy may or may not be about, you know, increasing metaverse literacy, because I think that's right. I think that's the right approach. I think where there are examples of people trying to actually, you know, facilitate training in the metaverse, I think we're falling back on old methods that are always a bit dissatisfactory anyway, and actually just going into these spaces and working out what's good and what's not good about them means that we can build better training. I don't think I'm being very specific. I'm going to try that point again. I think There's a lot of rebuilding classrooms, and the occasional alpine ski cabin is kind of maybe the jazziest that we get at the moment. But actually, we can build anything. We can start from the bottom up. And what we build, the environments we put people in, really affects people's mindsets, the way they're thinking, their receptiveness to learn new things. And I don't think we're playing enough with that yet. And if we try and just design learning before we really build our metaverse literacy, that's all we're going to get. I think things like the wellness space and the fitness space have done a much better job at just going, right, we can do anything. Let's throw some lightsabers around. Let's go and meditate on a mountain. What does this need to be? And I think we need to get our mindset there a bit more.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Sophie. I mean, there's been a lot of commentary recently saying, like, in a space where you can do anything, why are we so keen to recreate the world as it already exists? We've got a space for that. It's called the world. So why not try and do something different? Why not experiment and see what they can do? And you mentioned the other day about another platform you went into, I think, Sophie, Spatial.
Yeah.
And you just found that it was affecting your actual mindset, the environment you were in. That was a very interesting point you made.
Yeah, we were trying to have an intelligent conversation, but there were sort of whales floating around the sky. And we just started talking about big concepts, because that's what you can do when whales are floating around the sky. That's what you should do.
But interesting opportunities for that, right? To look at things differently, which is great. I just, in the interest of time, because we've got 15 minutes left, I believe, and no one else has posted in the chat. Shall we progress at this point, Sophie? Move on to your section.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, let's move on. Sorry, hang on there. So stop working for me. Lovely. So I'm just going to finish up very quickly. I don't know if I'm actually going to shorten my points. I might just talk very quickly and what this all means for you. And I was going to go with a poll, but I don't think we have time for this. But I would be interested to know, outside of this space, do you think it's useful for learning? Was the question I was going to position here, but really it's a bit of a trick question anyway, because from my perspective, the metaverse is just the next iteration of the internet. It's the evolution of the internet. So it's a bit like saying, is the internet good for learning? Clearly there are aspects that are, and maybe aspects that aren't. So a more useful thing to do might be to look at the sort of common features of what we can describe as a metaverse, and then think about the affordances that those features give us. So with that in mind, so amongst all the disagreement about what the metaverse is, these are sort of generally 3 features that are agreed upon that will be central to sort of anything that we can look at and point at and define as the metaverse in the future. And so that is presence, so that really feeling like you are in that virtual environment, that you're not just an observer, but you're actually inhabiting that world. It will be persistent. We'll be able to build profiles for ourselves that are recognized across lots of different platforms. And throughout all the definitions of the metaverse, it is an absolute given that this is going to be a social space. It's going to be a place where you can come and interact with people from all around the world. So with those sort of core features of the metaverse in mind, I'm just going to look at what some of the affordances of these features are in terms of learning and learning design. So these are just sort of things that I've pulled together from my travels around the internet and, dare I say it, around the metaverse. If you have any others to add, then please whack them in the chat. But in terms of presence, so Professor Sylvia Pan, she's a great one to follow if you're interested in these kind of topics. And she talks about how certain ways of accessing the metaverse, specifically virtual reality, allow you to be less explicit with your social interactions than on other platforms like video conferencing, which is less fatiguing, but it also helps you be more in the moment, which is really good for focus and concentration. And having that sense of place also triggers curiosity and creativity and all those, things that we need to be better learners. And we also know that practicing in the context that you're going to be applying your skill is really good for knowledge transfer. So those are the sort of main affordances of an improved presence for learning, as I see them. In terms of persistence, this is where it can all get a little bit mind-blowing and a little bit shoegazy if you're not careful. If you really start to think about what this convergence of the digital and the physical self could mean, because if we imagine that we're working in the metaverse as well, so all our sort of performance gaps, all our places where our abilities could be improved, that can all be automatically registered within the metaverse, and then a sort of bespoke training program can be tailored to you in this kind of virtuous feedback loop. And then all our achievements within that training can then, be lifelong. They can follow us from role to role in this persistent learner record kind of thing that we could create for ourselves. But maybe a bit more rooted in the here and now is that persistent spaces already exist and people can visit them from all over the world, which is really good for fostering a sense of belonging. And that's something that a lot of companies are struggling with at the moment, especially in terms of new starters. People. So being able to connect with people is useful for all kinds of reasons, even now. But with the metaverse, it's going to make it easier to connect with people from all around the world. So, in terms of learning, being able to connect with not just the highest performing people in your company, but from across the whole industry is obviously a really useful asset. But I think the biggest reason that social interaction is an affordance in the metaverse is because it's more human. Like, as humans, we get a big oxytocin hit from interacting with other people, from that social interaction. And that makes us less stressed. It makes us more receptive to trying and learning new things. So I just want to move on to some of the ways that you can start exploring some of these affordances. How am I doing for time? We've spoken a lot about workrooms already. So actually, I'm not going to play you this video, but one really easy way to get started is just to start moving some of your meetings over to some of the platforms we've spoken about, such as workrooms. There's a video, it's very widely available, you can go and look it up, that shows you some of the key features, and it kind of starts to give you a sense of how you could structure one of your meetings in the metaverse, in workrooms specifically. And if you wanted to take this a bit further, you could try an alt-space meetup where you can actually customize the space that you're meeting in. So this was one of our socially distanced meetups in 2021 at a rooftop bar in our office. And then if we take a look at Make Real's alt-space mansion, it all starts to look a little bit familiar here. It might start to look familiar around here. In terms of sort of functionality, there's not a lot you can do with alt-space to adapt it for training, but it's a great place to meet and share ideas and throw paper airplanes at one another, which we do every couple of weeks. So if you're looking to improve your metaverse literacy, I'd really recommend a little alt-space meetup. It's really easy to do, and you can access it from desktop as well. So that's that. So there's a few ways you can get started, but for this to be meaningful, you need to have a sort of a training goal in mind. What kind of training am I investigating this for? So lastly, I'm just going to focus on a couple of subject areas that I think could benefit from some of the affordances of the metaverse. One of them being onboarding. That's got to be such a big one, with the big resignation, if that is indeed happening. I know there's some debate around that, but the amount of money that companies spend on recruiting, getting the onboarding process right can be a real tangible investment. And something like a digital twin, as we just saw there, can allow you to meet and connect with other new starters or existing colleagues from all around the business. And it gives you a location to feel connected to beyond your own desk. And also we can start to think about this collapsing of the digital and the physical worlds into one another. So you can bring some sort of company data into your virtual world. Here we've got an example of team photos from team nights out in your virtual space, and sort of trophies that the company's won can appear around. And, we can flip that on its head as well, and we can have references to the virtual world in the real world or in other kind of digital locations that people frequent for this really siloed, really joined up onboarding experience. Leadership training is also another prime area to get started with the metaverse. It's this small defined cohort of practitioners who really benefit from the chance of socializing, interacting, sharing ideas. And for this kind of training, you can use breakout rooms to practice specific skills as well, run role plays, workshop ideas. So it's a productive space as well as a knowledge share environment. And that kind of training approach is probably valid for all sorts of cohorts of small practitioners, small cohorts, not small practitioners. The practitioners can be any size you want, small cohorts of practitioners, not just leadership. So do I have time to run through these 5 things? I think this is kind of our punchline. So I'm going to, unless anyone jumps in to stop me, I'm going to just go through this very quickly. I just wanted to pull together a few things that you can try to get started with the metaverse. So firstly, try things. We really advocate trying as many different things as possible. It doesn't all have to be in the training and productivity space. There's a lot happening in wellness and gaming at the moment as well, are really useful reference points. Our second point is you don't need to spend money. There's plenty of platforms that you can try that will increase your understanding of the metaverse without spending a penny. Almost everything we've talked about here today can be tried for free. You might want to consider getting your hands on a headset to sort of get the full experience, but you can log in via desktop on most of these things as well. There's also plenty of ways to spend money while you're exploring the metaverse, but we wouldn't recommend starting there. You might decide in the future that that's a good investment, but if it's your first sort of forays, what we really recommend is try the free things and build your understanding. Thirdly, think about what affordances the metaverse can really give you and your company to target your research for the best place to get started. And when you do get started, start off small. So, for example, we just spoke about leadership training there. We're not advocating that as your first adventure into the metaverse, you pull all your senior leadership training into the metaverse. We'd much sooner advocate, keeping the existing program, but maybe identifying a small test group to run metaverse sessions with alongside. And that's also a great way to get impact data, because you have this kind of ready-made A/B testing group. So you've got comparison data. You can compare the final learning outcomes between the two groups. But whatever you do, just get started. Go and get involved in the metaverse. It's an emerging space, and it needs as many people as possible now to be out there shaping it. So it's important that you just go and form an opinion. And with that, I was going to bring us in for a few tips on where to get started, but I think we might be out of time, I'm afraid. What do we reckon?
Well, there was one comment from Stevie Page, Sophie, and we do want to definitely give people a chance. So perhaps we'll run for that. I mean, we're in no huge rush to get off, but we're conscious that other people might be. So let's perhaps just pick up on Stevie's comment, and then if we have more comments, we can go on that. Steve Moray wants the tips as well. But just to cover off Stevie Page's comment, Stevie wants the tips. Let's do the tips. We can pick up with Stevie separately if needs be. Go for it.
Cool. Okay. Shall I do my tip first?
Yeah, go for
it. Listen to the weirdos. My tip. So, there's a lot of very sort of on-brand corporate messaging around the metaverse, which is interesting in and of itself, but it's also like there are a lot of clever people talking about this from a sort of creative arts point of view, and that would be things like games, going and playing the games, listening to people talking about games, the digital art space for looking at things like NFTs and blockchain and so on, and also critical theorists, philosophers, people who have a bit of out there thought about what's going on. It's a really interesting place to go and sort of. It's no substitute for doing it, but it's really good for giving a perspective on what you're doing.
I really agree with that. I think and it's something we spoke about at the beginning, there's this dangerous dominant voice, I think, and not to be controversial, but I think it is often a sort of white male voice as well in the realms of the kind of Zuckerbergs. There's a lot of keyboard warriors out there sort of trying to define, I think, the metaverse and trying to own the narrative. So the more people who get involved, the more the narrative is shared. So I think that's really important. But I also just wanted to call out a couple of people who are all women that I think it's worth following. So Sylvia Pan, who I mentioned earlier, who's professor of virtual reality at Goldsmith University. Absolutely follow her LinkedIn. She's got some really interesting stuff coming out. Kathy Hackle, again, sort of futurist, is a great person to follow in this space, saying some really interesting things. And some friends of ours, so Nikki Finnegan from St James's Place Wealth Management has been running a podcast, what's it called? I wrote it down. Journey to the Metaverse is what it's called. It's just a 4-part podcast, really worth a listen if you're interested in these subjects. And lastly, Kate Pasterfield as well, who is sort of an immersive learning expert who's doing a lot in the metaverse space. She is well worth a follow on the usual channels also. So those are my main plugs, main places to get started, I think.
Yeah, I would also add to that the Learning Hack podcast. There was Donald Clark, who many of you may know, who's never never shy of an opinion, but often has very interesting things to say as well. Did a session, a learning hacks session that you can find on YouTube that was actually recorded in the Make Real Metaverse alt space, which is, you know, an example of the metaverse that we've been talking about. And yeah, my main tip would be sort of listen to all of the different viewpoints, but try not to get caught up with the hype. If it sounds like hype, it most probably is. And you know, the best thing to do, as we've you know, repeatedly mentioned throughout this webinar, is to get in there and try it for yourself. And as we say, it doesn't need to be expensive. You don't need to buy any specialist equipment. You could go after this webinar, you could be in alt space in about 15 minutes, as long as you're willing to set up a Microsoft account. Get in there, try it for yourself, and form your own opinion, as Sophie mentioned earlier.
Nice. I'm just going to pop in the chat very quickly the comparison chart that Robin showed you earlier. So there are a few platforms that you can go and try and set up an account with, and maybe we can send that round, Tom, to the participants afterwards also.
Absolutely. We will share that in the community Slack channel, and of course have it there with the recording of this webinar. We are on the hour though. So I want to say thank you so much to all three of you. I think we're already seeing in the chat, this has been really interesting, lots of thank yous. I know I learned an awful lot from that. In the event that people kind of have more questions, as if that would be possible, surely this is all we would ever need to know. What's kind of the best way to get in touch? Where can they learn more, or if they have questions directly for yourselves?
More than happy for anybody to contact us. Obviously, we have social media channels. There's info@makereal.co.uk would get picked up as well. And also, you know, you can you can email me on robin.scott@makereal.co.uk. And if I don't have an answer for you, I will happily point you in the direction of somebody that does. But I'd also just like to reiterate as well, we've barely scratched the surface today. We really have barely scratched the surface. So hopefully we've demystified it a little bit, but there's you know, there's a lot of other spin-offs we could talk about, so there's plenty to chat about if indeed you want to do that.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all once again, and thank you everyone for joining us. As we've mentioned before, the recording will be available in the next couple of days in the members area, but otherwise, thank you very much for joining, and have a great rest of the day.
Thanks very much.
Bye.
Thanks.